Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started in about a minute. Okay, I have that. It is 3:45, so I will get started. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Heather Brandon-Smith. I am the Deputy Director for Foreign Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I also run the Militarism and Human Rights Program at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, or FCNL. And FCNL is a Quaker group. We're actually the oldest registered faith-based lobby in Washington, D.C. We're having our 80th anniversary this year. So it is great to be here with all of you and to talk about strategies for successful human rights advocacy. As is sort of noted in the description for this workshop, we're going to discuss several different issues at the intersection of human rights and militarism and provide tools for effective constituent advocacy to advance change in Congress. We will discuss everything from reaching out to congressional offices, how to conduct a lobby visit, other means for reaching your members of Congress, including emailing them about a particular issue, and also writing letters to the editor for local publications, which can be a really effective way to get your view on an issue in front of a member of Congress in a way that they really pay attention to. So before I get into these different tools that you all have at your disposal for effective lobbying, effective human rights advocacy, I wanted to talk about a few of the different issues that I work on at the intersection of human rights and militarism and the different legislative vehicles that we've been conducting advocacy on to support them. And at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, we have a very strong grassroots base, and they have lobbied on many of these issues over the years and have really made an impact when it comes to increasing support for these particular legislative measures. So it really is, very effective to have you all out there and talking to your representatives and your senators about these issues. So the first issue I wanted to discuss is the effort that we have to repeal or set a sunset or expiration date for the two war authorizations that were enacted in the post 9/11 period. So these are often referred to as AUMFs. This stands for Authorizations for Use of Military Force. So AUMF is the abbreviation, and I'm sure, as it always works out, you'll see that somewhere. You'll open up a paper and you'll see AUMF because that's how that works. So there are two AUMFs that are currently in use. The first one is the 2001 AUMF. And now that was passed 3 days after the 9/11 attacks, and Congress authorized the president to use force to target those responsible for the 9/11 attacks and also for those who harbored them. So that's generally understood, even though it was mentioned in the law itself in descriptive terms. They didn't actually name the groups who were targeted under that authorization for use of military force, or AUMF, but it's generally understood that it authorized force against Al-Qaeda, who attacked the United States on 9/11, and the Taliban, who harbored Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Now, this AUMF has been used to enable more than 2 decades of endless war. It's also been used to justify a lot of human rights abuses. So, for example, the CIA torture program, indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay. And also, these wars have led to the deaths of over 900,000 people, including more than 300,000 civilians. And they've also been used to justify using force in over half a dozen countries against an array of different groups that Congress has never actually voted to authorize. So, setting a sunset date or an expiration date for the 2001 AUMF is something that we have worked on a lot at FCNL. The big champion of this effort is Representative Barbara Lee of California. She regularly, each Congress, introduces a bill that would set a sunset date for the 2001 AUMF 8 months after enactment, and that's something that we've been supportive of. The other AUMF is the 2002 AUMF against Iraq. So this is the law that authorized the use of force against the Saddam Hussein regime. Under this particular law, it talked about the concerns of the US to defend itself against weapons of mass destruction that were allegedly possessed by the Saddam Hussein regime. Turned out that those allegations were false. Those weapons did not exist, yet we still went to war there. More than 126,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in this war. More than 4,500 US service members were killed. And President Obama declared the war over in 2011 and withdrew all US troops from the country. However, this law remains on the books, and it's not being used as the sole source of authority for any operations, but it's being claimed to provide additional authority for some operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and potentially elsewhere, the way that it's been defined. And so our concern with this law is that the longer that it remains on the books, the more it is open to abuse, whether by this or any future president. And we have seen the 2002 Iraq AUMF, the Iraq War Authorization, be abused. The most egregious example was in 2020, in January, when the Trump administration killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani and claimed that this nearly 2 decades old law authorized the killing of this Iranian general. This is something that Congress never voted to do. And shortly after, they actually passed a resolution demanding that President Trump cease all hostilities against Iran in response. But this law remains on the books. We are seeing some progress in that area. However, the House has actually voted twice to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF. Most recently in 2021, they had a strong bipartisan vote with 49 Republicans joining all but one Democrat. And then last month, we actually saw the Senate vote for the first time to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF. They voted 66 to 30. So the next stage for this is to bring this action back down to the House and to then send it to President Biden's desk. And one of the actual really helpful things about this effort is that President Biden has said that he supports repealing the 2002 Iraq AUMF. So we know that if it goes to his desk, he will sign it. He won't veto it. So we are very hopeful that that will happen this year. And I can talk a little bit more about actions that folks can take to reach out to your members of Congress to try and support that effort and make sure that it happens. A couple of other issues that I wanted to touch on that concern my work are civilian casualties. So as I mentioned, we've had more than 300,000 civilians who have been killed in these post 9/11 wars. And this continues to be an issue, while we're still conducting military operations. We're also seeing pretty significant discrepancies between the numbers of civilians killed who are reported by the US government and those who are found by independent researchers and investigators with researchers on the ground. So groups like Air Wars, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Center for Civilians in Conflict. These are groups who have researchers on the ground talking to people and documenting those who have been killed or injured from these strikes. And they are vastly different from the numbers reported by the US government. There have also been issues concerning the Department of Defense and the military's steps that they have taken to try and minimize civilian harm and to mitigate actions when it comes to US military operations and the effects that these might have on civilians. So you might all recall that in 2021, there was a strike in Kabul in response to an attack by ISIS in Afghanistan. The strike was supposed to be against someone from ISIS-K, which is as the group's known in Afghanistan. It actually was, the target ended up being a civilian aid worker, and the strike killed him and 10 other civilians, including 7 children. So this was really, an incident that brought to light the issues that groups like ours and the others that I've been mentioning have been pointing out for years about the need for the Department of Defense to really improve its policies and practices when it comes to minimizing civilian harm. So past efforts in the civilian casualty space have involved getting legislation to improve reporting requirements on civilian harm. We've also supported efforts to support the new or recently established Department of Defense Center of Excellence on Civilian Harm Prevention and Mitigation and Response. So that was something that arose out of this terrible Kabul strike, this acknowledged needs. Defense Secretary Austin really did acknowledge that there was this need in the Department of Defense to review civilian harm policy and practice and to assign more staff to undertake this work. And Congress last year appropriated $25 million to the Center of Excellence to ensure that this happens. Another issue we have worked on and continue to work on is what we call ex gratia, or compensation payments to victims of US strikes or to the families of those who've been killed in US strikes. So every year for the last few years, Congress has actually appropriated $3 million to be paid in compensation for these strikes. However, hardly any of that has actually been paid. So advocating for the payment of these funds that are made available by Congress to those who are victims or to the families of victims from these strikes is something that we've been working on. And finally, another issue that we work on is lethal force operations outside of war zones. So this has been something that has been carried on, for several administrations now. Basically, the U.S. government has a very broad reading of where it can use force as a matter of first resort outside war zones. So we would take the view that outside of war zones, you can't use force as a matter of first resort. We would apply stricter human rights law standards to those uses of force. This would require someone to pose an imminent threat to human life that can't be ameliorated by any other means, by, for example, arresting them. The US government says that as long as someone is a member of a group that we are fighting a war with, they can be in a country where it's at peace, but we can still kill them, target them with lethal force as a matter of first resort. Now, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of pushback about that, owing primarily to the huge number of people who were being killed by drone attacks outside of war zones. So what the Obama administration did was they imposed a stricter policy standard around using force outside of these war zones. They provided a summary of that. So it contained parameters like there must be near certainty that the target is present. There must be near certainty that civilians will not be harmed. And, capture operations are preferable to killing someone, things like that. And they were actually sued by the ACLU to release the full policy, and they eventually did so in redacted form in 2016. The Trump administration then came up with their own policy, again, didn't release it, again was sued, again was required to release it by court order, and then they did so. We had been hopeful that the Biden administration would sort of come out of the gate and release their policy, or potentially even say that they didn't want to conduct these strikes outside of war zones and that they would try and, deal with any issues through peaceful means or use force only as a last resort. However, they did implement their own policy, but they have not released it. In fact, they've only acknowledged that the policy exists, and then they leaked some information to the New York Times, who wrote about it in last October. So this effort to get this Biden administration lethal force policy out is ongoing. So when it comes to working with Congress, that's been more through talking to members of Congress and seeing if they might write to the administration to request that and make their voices known. So that's a little bit more of a DC approach, but I just wanted to let you know about the work that we are doing. So those are some of the issues that we are working on. And as I mentioned, there is a real opportunity this year to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF, the Iraq War Authorization. So I'm going to sort of talk about that as I'm going to sort of weave that into the discussion of your approach to advocacy on the Hill with your members of Congress, or not on the Hill, where you are with your members of Congress. So first of all, I want to just talk a little bit about organizing a lobby visit. And the first thing, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is to make sure that you lobby only your members of Congress. This is really key. Unfortunately, members of Congress really are only interested in hearing from their constituents. I have an example of my own personal life. My father-in-law once wrote letters to all of the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee about a particular issue that he was really, really concerned about. And I'm sure the letter was great, but he generally heard back from all of them saying, we're really only interested in what our constituents think. So the good part of that is that they are really interested in what their constituents think, and that is you. So make sure that you lobby only your members of Congress. And I want to share with you a few resources that we have at the Friends Committee on National Legislation about how we undertake lobby visits. So we have this document. I'm going to put a link in the chat, and then I will also share my screen. So here is the link that comes through, and then I will also now share my screen. Okay, here we go. So this is FCNL's virtual lobby visit roadmap. And so we provide this to all of our members when it comes to helping them prepare for their lobby visits. We set this up as a virtual lobby visit roadmap. It can also be very much easily converted into something that is used for an in-person visit, but it's my understanding that there are still a lot of lobby visits that are happening online. So as you can see here, we've sort of set it out so folks can fill in their members of Congress, what time, and then we always say that there should be a group leader. And we have had, folks come in and there is a delegation of one. So I do understand that not everybody will be lobbying in big groups, but it's always really helpful to have someone who's going to be a leader of the meeting, who will, sort of make sure that the ask is repeated clearly, facilitate the flow of conversation, and just sort of keep the meeting on track. And then we also designate a note taker to take notes at the meeting, but also be the person who is assigned with the task of responding or emailing either the member of Congress or their staffer after the meeting as a follow-up there. And so then we have here a lobby visit roadmap, and this is basically a step-by-step explanation of how a successful lobby visit can go. So obviously introduce yourselves, and one of the important things about introducing yourselves and also just setting up the meeting is to find out how much time the staffer or the member of Congress actually has. Sometimes they'll only have 5 to 10 minutes, so you want to make sure that you get all of your important points in during that time that you've been allocated. And so that is our second thing that I mentioned. It's really important, I'm down to number 3, to come in with something to thank your member of Congress for. Now, sometimes that's really easy. Your member of Congress might be very much on board with the issues that you think are important. Sometimes it is more difficult, but I will say, and we meet with folks all across the aisle from all sorts of backgrounds, we can always find something to thank them for. And it's just a really good way of developing rapport and setting up the meeting to have sort of a very positive, a positive start. So coming up with a thank you. And then we have a delegation member, so someone in the lobby group, introducing the ask. So I mentioned before that the ask here is that I've been talking about is repealing the 2002 Iraq War Authorization. So just being very upfront about this is the thing that we're coming to talk to you about. We want to make sure that this happens. If you were, for example, doing a visit with a member of the House of Representatives, you would want to urge them to vote for the bill to repeal the 2002 Iraq War Authorization when it comes to the House floor. And then The next part is really such an important part of the meeting, telling stories. So as it mentions here, this is where delegation members get to explain why you care about this issue, what it means to your community, how it relates to the ask. So telling something about yourself that relates to the particular thing that you want the member of Congress to do. And I will say that polling has been done on what is the most effective way to convince a member of Congress to do something. And it is through these personal stories. It's actually not through people like me going up on the hill and saying, well, the Constitution says this. That only has so much impact. What is actually the most effective is stories from constituents. So, I would urge you to really think about the stories that you have when it comes to the need to end this war authorization, to ensure that Congress takes the important step of debating and considering whether or not to authorize force, and that the president respects Congress's decision, even if they debate and decide not to authorize war, and think about how that affects you and what story you might have to share in that regard. Then item 6 is our next section, where it allows for a sort of more of a natural follow-up of questions and listen. So this is where you can sort of have, like I said, sort of just a natural flow of conversation with the staffer or with the member of Congress. So we've got some sample questions here. Like, do you support the ask? What other information do you need? Do you hear from constituents on this issue? Very often when it comes to these foreign policy issues, it's not always something that they're hearing from their constituents. So they can be really excited to hear that they are actually invested and interested in these matters of foreign policy, in these matters of war and peace. So that's what that next section is. And then the 7th item is to repeat the ask, repeat the thing that you're asking them to do. So you have another delegation member say, we'd really like your boss to vote to repeal the 2002 Iraq War authorization on the House floor. And then the next item is to have the group leader thank the legislator or the staffer. And then after, we've got the post-meeting follow-up. So email the staffer within 3 days of the visit to say thank you. Send the delegation list. So send the list of everybody who was part of the delegation when you met with the staffer or the legislator. And also, and also the leave behind. So FCNL prepares these documents called leave behinds or legislative asks, which we can link to in emails that provide a very, it's only a 1-page document explaining the issue and what we would like the member to do, so that the staffer and the legislator can refer to this document when evaluating whether they want to do the thing that they have been asked to do by their constituents. And we do say that it's important to follow up within 3 days of the visit, because that's when it's still fresh in the mind of the staffer or the legislator. So that is the lobby visit roadmap. And I've put the link in the chat. I will stop sharing my screen and come back here. And we will have some time at the end for questions. So the next thing that I wanted to talk to you all about is another way of reaching your member of Congress, and that is through emailing them. Now we have, I'm going to share my screen again. We have a whole page about emailing members of Congress. So here we go. So, and I will put the link in the chat again for this page. So this is where we have a whole bunch of different issues that we have done pre-prepared emails for folks to send their members of Congress. But as you can see up here, we start with write your own letter to Congress. So these are just, we have these different, email actions that you can certainly take, and, that we are very much supportive of, but we also very much, would encourage constituents to, if there is something in particular that you really want to share with your member of Congress and that you want them to do, you can write on one of those other issues. So I'm just going to click on this. And so as you can see, so I live in Maryland, so I've put my details in here before. So it's come up here with, my senators and my representative. And then it's sort of it's kind of done a nice little, easy way for you to get the information that you need to send emails to your senators and representative, and I can just type in whatever I want here. So it's sort of done a lot of the work for you rather than having to go to the websites and find the email. We just tried to make it a little bit easier. But we do also have, as I mentioned, pre-prepared emails that we have prepared on the particular issues that we advocate on. So I'm going to click on this one here about repealing the 2002 Iraq War Authorization. And so here is the pre-prepared email that we have done, and it's relatively short, but what we do really encourage is for folks to make these emails their own. So we put all of the information here, but as I mentioned, just as sharing your own individual stories is a much more effective way than, of lobbying, of advocacy, to convince a member of Congress to go with the ask that you are making. It's the same thing with emails. If they hear a personal message in an email rather than just hearing the sort of, wonky facts, that we sort of have a little bit of here, then that's going to have much more of an effect. It also, as a practical matter, has an effect because on the Hill in Congress, they generally get emails that are identical and they get grouped all together. So they really sort of get seen as sort of one email, or they can see how many folks have actually sent that email, but it's not going to have the same impact as an email that is, sort of more bespoke and directly from a constituent. So I very much recommend that even if you would like to write to your member of Congress about this particular issue, which I would love for you to do, to take this email and make it your own, change the subject if you like, put in your own story in the message. That is certainly a much more effective way of reaching members of Congress. But at the same time, if you don't have the time to do that, you can certainly send our pre-prepared form email. We think it's pretty solid. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is letters to the editor. So I will stop sharing my screen and come back to you all and talk a little bit about that. So yeah, as I mentioned, letters to the editor are a really effective way to reach your members of Congress because, when something is published in a local paper, it's not just them and their staff who sees it. Anybody who reads that paper can see it. So you could have hundreds of thousands of people reading this publication. And so that has a really strong impact on the member of Congress and their office, because they realize that it's not just them who are seeing it, but this could actually be influencing all of their constituents. We have had letters to the editor that our members have written that have actually sparked a response from a senator. So Senator Kane is the example. He actually responded to a letter to the editor that one of FCNL's members actually published in a local paper in Charlottesville. So they really are incredibly powerful, and it's a really fantastic way to get engaged. Generally, letters to the editor are actually quite short, so it's not too heavy of a lift. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about some sort of key tools for doing these letters to the editor. And so I have something else to put, another link to put in the chat, and I will go through this as well. So here we go. So this is our page about how to lobby locally, as it says there. And so I will just find the page to share it with you all. Okay. And now I will share my screen again. Okay, so this is the top of our page on lobbying locally, and then I'll scroll down, and this has got more information about, lobbying virtually, meeting with members of Congress, writing effective emails, which we just talked about, but I would highly encourage you to take a look at that as well if you would like to do that. And now we have our page on letters to the editor. So this is a resource that we have about writing your own letter to the editor. So in it, we use the raft as it says here, model for doing this. So respond to recent reports. You can also respond to, key anniversaries, for example. So recently, last month, we actually had the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. So that provided a lot of folks a key opportunity to write a letter to the editor about repealing the Iraq War authorization. And a lot of folks managed to get letters to the editor published in their local publications using that anniversary as a hook. Then the next thing is ask for action. So you want to make sure that you're asking the members of Congress that you're reaching out to do something in particular. So I mentioned that if you're doing a lobby visit, you would ask for them to vote to repeal the 2002 authorization for use of military force, or the 2002 Iraq War authorization. So that's the action. Find the facts, illustrate your argument with one or two facts. And again, just it has a little note that statistics can be a little confusing if you have too many. So just, one or two facts is great. And then tie it all together with your personal connection or your moral approach to the issue. So this is our page on letters to the editor. And we even have here this getting started page, which helps find local publications in your area. So that is also a really useful tool. And I wanted to also now share with you all a recent letter to the editor that an FCNL constituent was able to publish. So I will go and do that and just sort of take you through what made it such a successful letter to the editor and that was able to be published. So here we go. Okay, so this is a letter from the Courier. I believe it's an Indiana paper. So again, this used the 20th anniversary of. So this is actually from last year. It used the 20th anniversary of Congress passing the 2002 Iraq War authorization. So this was passed in 2002 in October, and the war started the next year in March. So it used that anniversary of the passage of the 2002 authorization for use of military force against Iraq as a hook for the letter to the editor. It talked a little bit about what's going on. It says it's 51 bipartisan co-sponsors of the Senate bill, how it had gone through committee. And then it made the ask for Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst to vote to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. So it's actually a very, brief letter. It's only 2 paragraphs long, but as I said, they can be extremely effective. It's really a fantastic way for constituents to be able to reach their members of Congress and for them to really pay attention to the issue that they are advocating on. So that is the presentation that I wanted to make to all of you, and I would be happy to take any questions. So I don't know if we have any questions. I can certainly talk a little bit more about the effort to repeal the 2002 AUMF and where things are at now. And if folks have questions, I can certainly stop and take those. So if that works. So how about I do that? Okay. So as I mentioned, there is a strong chance that the 2002 Iraq War authorization, or the 2002 AUMF, might actually get repealed this year for the first time. We had that very successful vote in the Senate last month, where they voted to repeal the 2002 AUMF by a vote of 66 to 30. So that is that was a really exciting and really strong bipartisan vote. And I see now, I will interrupt my own presentation to look at a question from Thomas Gould. Do you worry that the local media scope is too small to get an opinion voiced? I actually have found that the local media, and I assume you're talking about publishing letters to the editor, but they are very open to hearing about these issues. I work on foreign policy issues, obviously, as we mentioned. And as I mentioned earlier as well, most constituents who lobby their local members and their senators, they talk more about domestic issues. So it's been our experience that local media is very, very open to hearing about these foreign policy issues because they don't hear about them from constituents as often. So, FCNL's constituents have been very successful in getting these letters to the editor placed. So I would strongly encourage you to work to publish in local media. If you're struggling and you've submitted a couple of times and you haven't been able to get anything published, then perhaps look at ways to connect this to a local issue. We're spending a lot of money on military actions abroad, and if there are issues that are being underfunded domestically, then that could be one way to tie in this issue. The issue of wars abroad, taking funding away from local issues and then getting into the specific asks. So, just as we can use an anniversary of, the Iraq War AUMF being passed or the Iraq War starting as a hook, you can also use other issues as a hook to tie in this particular issue to a domestic issue or something that might be more interesting or to a local paper. So I would certainly encourage it. Like I said, our members have had quite a lot of success with that. Okay, Rashida Hastings, can an ask be too strong? We would like you to vote for, however, or we are reluctant to vote for because you support blank. Are you willing to listen to our position on why you should reconsider? So I think that, at FCNL, our members and we lobby everyone. We really are very issue specific. We don't look at party lines. I mean, we look at them to be able to figure out our approach. So, to your question there, Rashida, it is helpful to look at your member in terms of figuring out your approach. So you might want to, if you're going into an office that is not supportive of this, going in there and saying, we would still love to tell you about why we think this is so important as your constituents, and sometimes framing it in a more sort of constitutionally conservative way can be helpful. And when I say that, I just mean talking about the Iraq War authorization. We want you to repeal this because it's Congress's job to decide whether we go to war. And we really want you to do that job as your constituents. So I think, you have the ask, but I think how you frame it and how you talk to the member or how you talk to their staff about it is also really important. So that is a really, really great question and really important to sort of think about who you're going to be speaking to. If it's a friendly audience who is already on board, it's great. It's going to be a really fun meeting. You're going to be preaching to the choir and having a great time and just showing them how much you support them and thank them for their position. If it's a member who isn't supportive and you're trying to win them over, then approaching it really openly. Like I said in the lobby visit roadmap, really important to start with a thank you. Sort of develop a rapport with the office and see where you can go. Again, our members have had some surprising success with getting folks who might not necessarily have seemed supportive of this issue on board. One example is Senator Manchin in West Virginia. He can kind of really go either way on these issues, and our we call them advocacy teams. They're the really active grassroots members that we have. They have such a strong relationship with them that they sort of see meeting with them as like meeting with FCNL, and he ended up co-sponsoring the bill to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF from our constituents, not from the Washington DC advocates. So I would strongly encourage you to still have the meetings, still do the outreach and develop that rapport with the member, because you never know where things can go over time, especially when it comes to these issues of war and peace and being in these wars for over 20 years. Members of Congress do change their positions over time. So definitely get in there. All right, we have a question from John Holden. Can you comment on how much members of Congress or their staff follow social media, and to what extent is that another important avenue to reach out to a member of Congress? Well, the best way to do that? That is an excellent question, John. It really varies from office to office, I will say. So you can go and take a look at your member and see how many followers they have. It's that's kind of an indication, and also how much they tweet. It's kind of an indication of how engaged they are. One of the best things that you can do when it comes to engaging them on social media is to thank them when they do something good. So, when we did have that Senate vote to repeal the Iraq War authorization, we sent out a whole bunch of thank yous to all of the different members of Congress who voted in favor and who put out statements. So if your member of Congress voted for that, if your senator voted for that, then that is a really good opportunity to reach out and say thank you, because then they're seeing from their constituents and from their followers that it really is important to them. So yeah, I would say that thanking them is probably the best thing to do when there is a window. Also, if there is a bill introduced that you want them to support, you could say, hey, this bill just came out. I really want my senators, blah, blah, and blah, blah, or I really want my representative, insert, to support this bill, to co-sponsor this bill. That's another way of reaching out to them. So if there is a hook to make that ask of them, but also, thanking them is a really great thing to do. Any other questions? So as we wait for any other questions to come in, I can talk a little bit about the path for this 2002 AUMF repeal effort this year. So as I mentioned a couple of times now, the Senate's voted to repeal the 2002 AUMF. The House actually did it in the last Congress. Unfortunately, the Senate calendar was incredibly full, and they just weren't able to get it to the Senate floor, which was a real shame, but we are where we are. So, and now the House is in control of the Republican Party, which is not as supportive of repealing the 2002 AUMF. However, this is a bipartisan effort, and I want to be really clear on that. And we are a nonpartisan organization. So this is a very strong bipartisan effort. In the Senate, it was led by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia and Senator Todd Young of Indiana. Oh, and sorry, that letter to the editor was an Iowa letter, not an Indiana letter. My apologies there. So they had a really strong group of co-sponsors. I think they ended up with 24 co-sponsors, with an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and some additional Democrats have since joined the bill. And in the House, it is led by Representative Barbara Lee, Representative Chip Roy, who's a Republican from Texas, Representative Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, and Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma. And they currently have 42 bipartisan co-sponsors, with an equal number of Republicans and Democrats too. I'm going to now go to a question from Edith. So, is a personal story about your son's experience in Iraq acceptable? And saying this is why I support repeal, prefaced by, I'm not a total pacifist, but the impact of war is long-lasting and sometimes permanent. Yes, absolutely, Edith. That is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about when it comes to personal stories. So if you are able to share that, that would be an incredibly powerful way to connect with your lawmaker and their staff on this issue. We actually work with a group called Secure Families Initiatives, which is a military families group. They're a really wonderful group who are very much working to repeal the 2002 AUMF, and they go into meetings where they talk about their own personal stories, being married to people in the military and their experience of being part of the family of someone who has experienced war. So absolutely, that is a wonderful story to be able to share with your legislator, and why this impacts them. And honestly, I mean, legislators tend, by and large, they're not all pacifists at all. So, but they do see the importance of Congress weighing in to make this solemn decision about whether to send people into war. And so that is often the angle that they are approaching this issue from. So to hear from those who have been affected by war, whether directly or whether as a family member, is often incredibly powerful. So, yes. So we've only got a minute and a half remaining. So I will just say that current efforts now, when it comes to repealing the Iraq War authorization, are to try and get it directly to the House floor. That might be a little complicated. The committee of jurisdiction for this issue is the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the chairman of that committee, Representative Michael McCall, unfortunately is not supportive of this effort. So until he is, this might not be the way to get it there. However, there is hope that an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a piece of must-pass legislation, that an amendment to that bill to repeal the Iraq War authorization can be attached. So, having members of Congress propose it and have the House vote on the floor to include it in this must-pass legislation, which I will say they have done before. They did it in 2019, and then have that get to the president's desk through the National Defense Authorization Act is another way that we could make this happen this year, and we're planning to work really hard to make this happen. So in my last 23 seconds, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you who have joined me here. If you want to reach out, please feel free. My Twitter is at hbrandonsmith, and my email address is hbrandon-smith@fcnl.org. Thank you.